The cobblestones outside the Suleimani barracks are still wet from last night's rain. You lace your leather boots tighter, pulling the straps until your fingers ache. The recruiting officer told you 3 weeks ago this would be a short campaign. 6 months of glory, he said. You would march to the western frontier, plant the imperial banner on a few Hungarian walls, and be back in Istanbul before the next harvest. Your mother packed you dried figs and a small leather pouch of salt. Now it is February. You are not in Istanbul. You are face down in a frozen ditch somewhere outside the town of Eger in modern-day Hungary, scraping crystallized mud off your beard. Your boots fell apart 3 weeks ago. You wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from a dead man's coat. In your trembling palm you weigh 2 small hard objects. They are biscuits. Each one is roughly the size of a child's fist and about as soft as a roofing tile. You have not eaten in 2 days. The math is simple and terrible. If you eat both biscuits tonight, you will sleep with a full stomach and probably die tomorrow when the column moves at dawn. If you eat one and save the other, you will be hungry tonight, hungry tomorrow, and possibly still alive by sunset. You make your decision. You wrap the second biscuit in cloth and tuck it against your bare skin under your shirt so it does not freeze solid. The body heat will keep it chewable. This is not a story your grandchildren will ever hear. This is not what the storytellers will sing about in the coffee houses back home. The storytellers will sing about the cannons of Sultan Suleiman, the silken banners of the Janissaries, the gleaming scimitars catching the sunlight. They will not sing about the biscuit pressed against your ribs. Here is the brutal mathematical reality that almost no history textbook will ever tell you. The vast majority of Ottoman soldiers who died on campaign never saw an enemy face. They were not killed by Austrian musket balls or Persian arrows or Mamluk lances. They were killed by the road itself, by the dysentery that ran through the camps like a second army, by the rotting feet inside their boots, by the corrupt supply officer back in Belgrade who sold their flour ration on the black market and replaced it with sawdust. The deadliest weapon in the Ottoman Empire was not the cannon. It was the distance between the soldier and his next meal. Before we walk into one of the most extraordinary logistical achievements in military history, if you appreciate uncovering the forgotten human stories behind the great empires, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Drop a comment below telling me where you are listening from. I find it genuinely incredible that we get to sit together across thousands of miles and explore the lives of people the official histories tried to erase. Now let us begin. Let us strip away the romantic myths. When you picture the Ottoman army at its peak in the 16th century, you probably imagine something out of a museum painting. Glittering cavalry in golden armor, sultans in jeweled turbans on white Arabian horses, cannons the size of small houses being dragged across blooming meadows. The reality on the ground was almost grotesquely different. The Ottoman Empire at its territorial maximum stretched from the gates of Vienna in Central Europe all the way to the mountains of Yemen, and from the Algerian coast to the highlands of Persia. Holding that empire together meant one thing above everything else. You had to be willing to march, and not just 100 miles or 200. The campaign from Istanbul to the Hungarian theater of war was roughly 1,000 miles each way. The march from Istanbul to Baghdad during the Persian Wars was over 1,200 miles. The expedition to suppress the Yemeni revolt under Koka Sinan Pasha required moving thousands of men over 1,800 miles, including across the Arabian desert. A normal European monarch in the same century might have struggled to march an army 200 miles before the soldiers mutinied or starved. The Ottomans moved armies of 100,000 men across 2,000 miles and expected them to arrive in fighting condition. This was the most logistically sophisticated army on the planet, and it still buried the majority of its men in roadside graves with no markers. Think about that paradox for a second. The most efficient war machine in human history was killing its own soldiers faster than any enemy ever could. How does that happen? How does an empire become so good at the impossible that it normalizes mass death as the cost of doing business? Before we judge the Ottoman commanders as cruel monsters who fed men into a meat grinder, we have to look at the disaster that taught them everything. The year is 1532. Sultan Suleiman, the Magnificent, is at the height of his power, and he decides he is going to take Vienna. 3 years earlier he had besieged the city and failed. Now he is back with an even bigger army, somewhere between 120,000 and 150,000 men, supported by a baggage train so long that, when the front of the column reached a town, the rear was still in the previous province. The campaign was supposed to be a triumphant return. It became a graveyard. The rains came early that year. The roads through the Balkans turned into rivers of brown mud. Wagons sank up to their axles. Oxen collapsed from exhaustion and were left where they fell, blocking the road for the men behind. The supply train fell catastrophically behind the main column. By the time Suleiman's army reached the Austrian frontier, dysentery had ripped through the camps. Soldiers were dying in pools of their own filth before they ever drew a sword. The army never even reached Vienna. They besieged a tiny fortress at Guns instead, lost interest, and turned around. The retreat back to Istanbul was worse than the advance. Frozen men, starving men, men with feet so blackened by frostbite they could no longer remove their boots. Suleiman returned to his capital alive, but he had buried tens of thousands of his finest troops along the way. Most of them had never fired a weapon. Now it is your turn. You are Grand Vizier Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, standing in front of a furious sultan who has just realized that geography is going to defeat the empire long before any Austrian general does. You cannot tell the sultan to stop expanding. You cannot tell him to be satisfied with the territory he has. You have to solve the impossible. You have to make it physically possible to march 100,000 men across 1,000 miles and arrive ready to fight. Sokollu Mehmed Pasha was one of the most brilliant administrators the empire ever produced, and he understood something his peers did not. The next war the Ottomans had to win was not against a foreign army. It was against the road itself. He launched what we would today call a complete logistical revolution. He commissioned a network of imperial supply stations stretching across the entire empire. He created a permanent corps of military engineers whose only job was to build and maintain campaign roads, river crossings, and bridge networks. He standardized the production of military rations so that a soldier marching across Anatolia would eat the same biscuit baked to the same specifications as a soldier marching across Bulgaria. He even authorized the construction of floating bakeries on the Danube River so that fresh bread could be baked and distributed to the army while the troops were still moving. By the time Sokollu was finished, the Ottoman Empire had something no other 16th-century power possessed. It had an industrial-scale supply chain operating across 3 continents. And yet, despite all of this engineering genius, the soldier in the ditch was still weighing 2 biscuits in his palm and deciding which one to eat first. Genius at the top does not always reach the man at the bottom. So how do you actually feed 100,000 men marching across what would be 3 modern time zones? You start with bread, not the soft, fresh bread you imagine sitting in a basket on a dinner table. You start with peksimet. Peksimet is the single most important object in the entire history of Ottoman warfare, and almost nobody outside of Turkish military historians has ever heard of it. The word literally means twice baked. It is a piece of bread that is baked, sliced, and then baked again at low heat until every drop of moisture has been driven out of it. The result is a hard biscuit roughly the size of a small fist that can survive being carried across a desert, dropped in a river, frozen in a snowdrift, and still be edible months later if you soak it in water or tea or even just your own saliva. A single Ottoman soldier on campaign was issued roughly 700 grams of peksimet per day. That is the entirety of his guaranteed food. Everything else he ate had to be foraged, traded for, or stolen. The peksimet was his clock, his currency, his religion, and his survival. Veterans of multiple campaigns spoke about it the way modern soldiers speak about their rifles. It was the object that separated life from death. To produce enough pexamate for a major campaign required the conversion of entire cities into bread factories. The town of Edirne, on the route to the Balkans, was essentially repurposed during campaign seasons into a single massive bakery district. Thousands of ovens ran day and night for months in advance of a campaign departure. The state purchased grain by the boatload from the Black Sea coast and the Egyptian delta, and shipped it to the bakery towns where it was milled, baked, dried, and packed into woven sacks. But baking the bread was the easy part. Moving it was where the real horror of the numbers begins. A single Hungarian campaign in the late 16th century required somewhere in the range of 40,000 oxen pulling 12,000 supply carts. Each cart carried roughly 500 kilograms of supplies. To put that in modern terms, the Ottoman army was operating a logistics fleet roughly equivalent to a major shipping company, moving its entire annual inventory across a war zone. And every single cart had to be repaired, every single ox had to be fed and watered, every single driver had to be paid, every single axle had to be greased. The empire built an entire shadow economy of wheelwrights, leather workers, blacksmiths, and farriers who traveled with the army. Without them, the campaign died within a week. The system that made all of this possible was called the Menzelhain network. A menzil was a campaign way station, pre-stocked with grain, water, fodder for animals, and tools for repairs. They were spaced roughly 1 day's march apart along every major campaign route. This meant that an Ottoman army on the march did not have to carry months of supplies on its back. It could move from station to station, drawing fresh pexamate and water at each stop, like a 16th century version of refueling at a highway gas station. At its peak, the Menzelhain system stretched from the suburbs of Istanbul all the way to the outskirts of Baghdad. It is one of the most underappreciated infrastructure projects in human history. The Romans built roads. The Ottomans built a continent-wide vending machine for soldiers. Now let us talk about the technology that made these systems possible, because the engineering was genuinely centuries ahead of its time. The Ottomans did not just move supplies. They moved infrastructure itself. The most extraordinary example is the Seyyar-Firin, the mobile field oven. These were enormous wagon-mounted brick ovens, designed to be hauled by teams of oxen, that could be assembled and lit at the end of a day's march. The ovens used a clever modular brick design, so they could be partially disassembled for transport and reassembled at the campsite within a few hours. Fresh bread would emerge from these ovens before the sun went down, distributed to soldiers who had marched 30 kilometers that day on biscuits and salted meat. The smell of baking bread in a military camp at twilight is a memory that comes up again and again in surviving Ottoman campaign diaries. Then there were the bridge engineers, the Köprü Corps. The Ottomans developed a pontoon bridge technology so advanced that European observers wrote home in disbelief. A team of Köprü could span a river that would have stopped any European army for days. They used flat-bottomed boats lashed together with iron cables and topped with timber decking that could be hammered into place by a trained team in roughly 8 hours. The army would arrive at a river in the morning, the engineers would deploy, and by sundown 100,000 men plus oxen and artillery would be on the other side. To understand how shocking this was at the time, imagine the modern equivalent. It would be like an army today rolling McDonald's franchises, mobile water treatment plants, Home Depot supply stores, and bridge-building factories down the highway alongside the tanks and the troop carriers. The Ottomans were running a mobile civilization at the speed of a marching man. And yet the soldier in the ditch is still chewing on his frozen biscuit, because here is the brutal truth about all logistical genius. It can feed the army. It cannot save the soldier. The gap between the system on paper and the reality in the boots is where most Ottoman men died. Let us step away from the maps with the colored arrows and the diagrams of supply networks. Let us walk into the marching column itself. Let us look at the human body on the road. The first thing you would notice is the smell. A column of 100,000 men marching for weeks without a proper bath, in heavy wool uniforms, in summer heat or winter rain, produces a smell that veterans described as a moving fog. Lice infestations were so universal that soldiers shaved their entire bodies, including their heads. As a matter of basic survival, the lice carried typhus. Typhus killed without warning. A man could be marching at noon and dead by midnight, his body left in a shallow grave by the side of the road, marked only by a stick pushed into the dirt. The second thing you would notice is the feet. Ottoman military boots were made of stitched leather and lasted, in ideal conditions, perhaps 3 months. On a long campaign, they did not survive that long. Wet leather rotted. Constant marching abraded the soles. By the second month, the average soldier was effectively walking on raw skin wrapped in rags torn from blankets or stolen from corpses. Feet became the single most important medical concern in the entire army. A man with destroyed feet was a man who could not march, which meant a man who would be left behind. Left behind meant dead. There was no medical evacuation system. There was no field hospital that could carry you home. If you fell out of the column, you stayed where you fell. The third reality was dysentery. Diarrhea in a 16th century military camp was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. The water was almost always contaminated, either from animal waste, human latrines dug too close to drinking sources, or simply from the rivers carrying disease downstream from earlier camps. A man who developed severe dysentery would lose 10 to 20% of his body weight in a week. He would become too weak to march, too weak to defend himself, too weak to eat. He would be dead within 2 weeks, sometimes faster. There is a specific verified case from the 1578 Caucasus campaign that I find absolutely chilling. Lala Mustafa Pasha was leading an Ottoman force into the territory of modern-day Georgia and Azerbaijan. Before his army even reached the first significant enemy outpost, a single regiment of his expeditionary force lost over 4,000 men to disease, exposure, and starvation. 4,000 men, erased from the rolls without a single Persian or Georgian soldier firing a shot in their direction. I genuinely cannot wrap my mind around that statistic. We talk about the great Ottoman campaigns as if they were carefully orchestrated military operations. The truth is that most of them were extended exercises in attrition where the empire poured men into a meat grinder of distance and disease, and a fraction of them came out the other side ready to fight. The soldier who survived to actually face an enemy army was already a miracle of human endurance. He had outlasted the road. The battle was almost an afterthought. Now let us talk about the people the history books almost never mention. Forget the cinematic image of the Janissary in his white felt cap and feathered plume. Forget the Sipahi cavalryman with his lance and his banner. The Ottoman army at its peak ran on a workforce of invisible men whose names appear in no chronicle and whose faces appear in no painting. The Sarahar were the labor corps, peasant conscripts pulled from villages across the empire whose only job was physical work. They dug the latrines that kept dysentery from killing the army even faster than it did. They repaired the roads that the supply carts cracked open. They cleared the brush from campsites. They cut firewood. They buried the dead. They did not fight. They did not get medals. They got fed last, paid worst, and died in the highest numbers of any group in the army. The Devesi were the camel drivers. In the eastern and southern campaigns, the entire supply system depended on camels, and the camel drivers were almost universally drawn from Arab and Kurdish communities. A trained Devesi could keep a string of 40 camels moving across a desert without losing a single animal, which sounds easy until you realize that a dehydrated camel is the single most dangerous animal a soldier could encounter. The Saka were the water carriers. In every Ottoman camp, the water carriers were the people who actually kept the army alive. They walked back and forth between rivers, springs, and wells, carrying enormous leather water bags slung over their shoulders, distributing water to fighting men who outranked them, and to officers who barely acknowledged their existence. Without the Saka, the entire army died within 72 hours. Without them, every campaign collapsed. And then there were the Nalban, the horseshoers, and the Demiasai, the blacksmiths. Imagine an army of 100,000 men supported by 40,000 oxen and tens of thousands of cavalry horses. Every single hoof needed to be shod, checked, repaired, and reshod constantly throughout the campaign. The blacksmiths worked from before sunrise to after sunset, in shifts, hammering at portable forges set up in every campsite. The elite janissaries got the glory and the songs and the paintings on the palace walls. The Sarahar, the Devesai, the Saka, and the Nalbant got the unmarked graves. Honestly, when you actually look at how the Ottoman army functioned at the human level, you start to realize something uncomfortable. The empire was not built by the soldiers who killed. It was built by the workers who carried. Now let us talk about the math of corruption, because this is where the story gets darker. The Ottoman state, like every massive empire in history, was administered by a class of officials whose job was to make sure resources flowed correctly from the capital to the front lines. The supply commissioners were called mubashir. On paper, the mubashir was responsible for purchasing grain, baking pexament, organizing transport, and ensuring that every soldier received his daily ration. In practice, the mubashir was often the difference between a soldier who lived and a soldier who died. Because the mubashir was, in many cases, the most dangerous enemy the soldier ever faced. A corrupt mubashir could skim 20 to 30% of the grain shipment, sell it on the black markets of Belgrade or Aleppo or Damascus, and replace the missing weight in the ration sacks with sawdust, chaff, ground bone, or sand. Soldiers would open their ration bags weeks into a campaign and find biscuits so adulterated they could not be chewed even after soaking. There is a specific historical case from the long Turkish War of 1593 to 1606. Ottoman soldiers fighting on the Hungarian frontier began opening their pexament rations to find biscuits that crumbled into a gritty paste because the flour had been cut with so much sawdust and ground straw. Officers wrote angry letters back to Istanbul demanding investigations. Most of the investigations went nowhere. The mubashir responsible had already cashed his profits and disappeared into a comfortable retirement on an estate purchased with the blood of his own army. The empire did not lose its great wars because its enemies were stronger. It lost them because its administrators ate the army from the inside. The cannons in Belgrade had to be rebored because the gunpowder shipments had been adulterated with brick dust. The horse fodder arriving in the Eastern Theater was found to be moldy because someone in the supply chain had switched the fresh grain for spoiled stock and pocketed the difference. The boots issued to recruits in 1595 were so poorly made that entire regiments arrived at the front without functioning footwear. And while this corruption ate away at the army, the soldier in the ditch was still weighing his 2 biscuits. He did not know that one of them had been cut with sawdust. He just knew it tasted strange and his stomach hurt. He did not know that his suffering was not the cost of war. It was the cost of someone else's profit. This brings us to one of the most extraordinary battles in Ottoman history, a battle that almost nobody outside of Turkish and Hungarian historians has ever heard of. It is October of 1596. Sultan Mehmed II has personally taken the field, which is unusual. Most sultans by this period preferred to stay in Istanbul and let their grand viziers do the marching and dying. Mehmed III has brought a massive army to the Hungarian plain, somewhere in the range of 80,000 to 100,000 men, to confront a combined Habsburg and Transylvanian force near a small village called Mesocrests. By the time the two armies meet on the field, the Ottoman soldiers have been on campaign for months. They are starving. They have not been paid in weeks. Their boots are falling apart. The pexament in their ration bags has been cut so thoroughly with sawdust and chaff that some men have begun to refuse it, preferring to forage for wild roots and tree bark. The battle begins on October 24th. For the first 2 days, the Ottomans take heavy casualties. The Habsburg forces, well supplied and well rested, push hard against the Ottoman center. On the third day, October 26, something extraordinary happens. The Habsburg cavalry breaks through the Ottoman lines and reaches the supply camps in the rear. They begin looting, and here is where the story becomes almost unbelievable. The Ottoman soldiers, watching their own supply camps being overrun, do something that should have been impossible. They abandon their battle positions and start looting their own supplies, not in panic but in fury. They had spent months marching on starvation rations while their own quartermasters grew wealthy on stolen grain. Now, with the supply tents finally open and unprotected, they took what they had been denied. Tents full of fresh grain that had never been distributed, sealed barrels of olives, casks of wine that had been hoarded for officers. They ate. For the first time in months, they actually ate. And then, full of food for the first time in weeks, they turned around and attacked. The Habsburg cavalry, scattered and disorganized in the looting, was caught completely off guard. The Ottoman counterattack shattered the imperial line. By the end of the day, the Habsburg army was in full retreat. The Battle of Mesocrests was an Ottoman victory. It was won by starving, unpaid, barefoot men who had eaten their first proper meal in months, taken from supplies that had been stolen from them by their own officers. After the battle, the surviving Ottoman soldiers did something unprecedented. They walked the field, collected the bodies of the honored dead, and buried them with the full rites that Ottoman military tradition demanded. But when they found the bodies of the Mubashir, the supply commissioners who had cut their flour with sawdust and sold their grain on the black market, they refused to bury them. They left them where they had fallen, exposed to the elements and the carrion birds, with no prayers spoken over their corpses. It was the closest thing to a verdict that 16th-century Ottoman soldiers had any power to deliver. The empire would not punish the corrupt. So the army did, in the only way it could. Now let us bring this back to the present day, because this is not just a story about dead men in a foreign field 430 years ago. We celebrate generals. We celebrate sultans. We celebrate CEOs and presidents and astronauts and the people whose faces appear on the covers of magazines. We forget, almost completely, the people who actually carry the weight. The Pexamit biscuit did not disappear when the Ottoman Empire fell. It just changed shape. It became a granola bar in a backpack at 3 in the morning. It became a bottle of warm water on a delivery scooter weaving through traffic in the rain. It became a pre-packed sandwich eaten at a fluorescent-lit break table by an Amazon warehouse picker who has been on her feet for 10 hours. Modern civilization runs on an invisible army of logistical workers in the exact same way the Ottoman Empire did. The long-haul truckers who keep grocery shelves stocked. The container ship crews who spend months at sea moving the actual physical objects of the global economy from one continent to another. The food delivery riders who keep cities fed. The warehouse pickers who run mile after mile across concrete floors fulfilling orders for people who will never know their names. They are the Sarahur and the Saka and the Devese of the modern world. They carry the empire on their backs. They are paid the worst, respected the least, and named never. And just like in the 16th century, there are still Mubashir among them. There are still administrators and middlemen and corporate officers who extract a percentage from every meal carried, every package delivered, every hour worked. The form has changed. The function has not. The biscuit pressed against the soldier's skin under his shirt to keep it from freezing has become a phone screen tucked into a delivery rider's jacket to keep the battery warm. Honestly, if you really sit with this comparison for a minute, it becomes hard to look away. We have built another empire. It is held together by another invisible army, and we do not see them either. That is the real lesson of Ottoman military logistics. History is not the story of the men in jeweled turbans on white horses. It is the story of the men in rotting boots in frozen ditches, weighing 2 biscuits in the dark and deciding which one to eat. Empires do not fall when foreign armies show up at the gates. They fall the moment they stop respecting the people who carry the weight. They fall when the Mubashir grows fatter than the soldier. They fall when the painters paint the Sultan and forget the camel driver. The Ottoman Empire lasted for over 600 years because, in its strongest centuries, the system still worked. The Peximet still reached the front. The bridges still got built. The water carriers still showed up at dawn. When that stopped being true, the empire began to die. Not because of cannons, because of corruption. Not because of foreign armies, because of forgotten men. If this journey into the brutal, forgotten reality of how empires actually function made you think differently about the people you walk past every day, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more stories like this one. What other forgotten histories or hidden human realities would you like me to explore in future videos? Drop your suggestions in the comments. I read every single one, and your ideas genuinely shape the videos we make. Thank you for sitting with this story. Thank you for caring about the people the history books tried to bury. I will see you in the next video.